Marcus Thompson had always believed that preparation was the key to survival, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the day the world ended. As the head of security for Clearwater Research Station, a remote facility nestled in the mountains of Colorado, he had spent years drilling evacuation procedures and emergency protocols with his team. The station housed 47 researchers, support staff, and security personnel, all dedicated to studying climate patterns and atmospheric changes. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment, the kind of job that looked good on a resume but rarely tested one's actual skills. That changed on a Tuesday morning in October when Dr. Elena Rodriguez burst into the security office, her face pale and hands trembling. She had been monitoring global communications when the first reports started flooding in from major cities. Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, all reporting the same impossible phenomenon. People were attacking each other in the streets, displaying inhuman strength and an apparent immunity to pain. The initial reports dismissed it as mass hysteria or some kind of coordinated terrorist attack using unknown chemical agents. Marcus watched the security feeds from around the world with growing dread. The footage was grainy and often cut short, but what he saw defied explanation. Crowds of people moving with jerky, unnatural movements, overwhelming police barriers and emergency responders. The infected, as they were being called, seemed driven by a singular purpose: to attack and bite anyone they encountered. Those who were bitten either died within hours or joined the growing hordes of the infected. Within 6 hours, every major population center had gone dark. Satellite imagery showed fires burning unchecked across continents. The government's emergency broadcast system repeated the same message on loop: seek shelter, avoid contact with infected individuals, and wait for further instructions. But as the hours turned into days, no further instructions came. The silence from the outside world became deafening. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the station's director, called an emergency meeting in the main conference room. The research team had been working around the clock, trying to understand what was happening through their satellite connections and radio equipment. What they discovered painted a grim picture. The infection spread faster than any known pathogen, and the infected displayed characteristics that challenged everything they knew about human physiology. They didn't seem to tire, rarely showed signs of decay in the early stages, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect uninfected humans. Marcus found himself thrust into a leadership role he had never wanted. Dr. Mitchell was brilliant in her field, but she was a scientist, not a survivor. The other staff members looked to him for guidance on security matters, but the scope of their situation extended far beyond his training. They had enough food and water for maybe 2 months if they rationed carefully. The facility's backup generators could run for another 6 weeks on their current fuel supply. After that, they would be living in the dark. The first real test of their defenses came on the 8th day. A group of survivors from the nearby town of Pine Ridge had made their way up the mountain, seeking shelter. Among them were families with children, elderly residents, and several people who had been injured during their escape. Marcus watched through the security cameras as they approached the main gate, and his heart sank. 3 of the group were clearly infected, though they seemed to be in the early stages where they could still function somewhat normally. The decision to let them in sparked the first major conflict within the station. Dr. Mitchell argued for providing humanitarian aid, insisting they could quarantine the sick and help the healthy survivors. Marcus disagreed, knowing that even one infected person inside their perimeter could doom them all. The debate raged for hours while the survivors waited outside, some of them clearly deteriorating as the infection progressed. In the end, the infected made the decision for them. As night fell, they turned completely, attacking the other survivors in their group. Marcus watched in horror as chaos erupted outside the gates. He gave the order to activate the facility's lockdown protocols, sealing all entrances and activating the perimeter defense systems. The screams from outside lasted until dawn, a haunting reminder of the world they now inhabited. The survivors who remained uninfected were eventually brought inside after a careful screening process that Marcus had developed. Among them was Jake Morrison, a former Army medic whose field experience proved invaluable, and Lisa Chen, a teacher who took charge of organizing the civilian survivors. Their arrival brought the station's total population to 63 people, stretching their already limited resources even thinner. As Marcus stood on the facility's observation deck that night, looking out at the dark landscape below, he realized that their fight for survival had only just begun. Part 2. The integration of the Pine Ridge survivors created new challenges that tested every system Marcus had put in place. Jake Morrison proved to be an invaluable ally, his military background complementing Marcus's security expertise. Together, They established a rotation schedule that ensured someone was always monitoring the perimeter, communications equipment, and the facility's vital systems. Lisa Chin worked with Dr. Mitchell to organize the civilian population, creating work assignments that kept everyone busy and contributing to their collective survival. The children presented unique difficulties that no one had anticipated. Among the survivors were 3 kids under the age of 12, including 7-year-old Emma Martinez whose parents hadn't made it out of Pine Ridge. The sound of children crying or playing could potentially attract infected from miles away, and keeping them quiet during the mandatory silence periods required constant vigilance. Lisa developed educational programs that kept the children occupied while teaching them essential survival skills, but the psychological toll of their situation was evident in their withdrawn behavior and frequent nightmares. Food rationing became a daily source of tension. Dr. Rodriguez, who had taken charge of inventory management, calculated that their supplies would last exactly 47 days at current consumption levels. Every meal became a careful balance of maintaining morale while conserving resources. Arguments broke out over portion sizes, and Marcus found himself mediating disputes between people who had been colleagues just weeks earlier. The stress of their situation was beginning to fracture the group's unity. The facility's radio equipment provided their only connection to the outside world, and what they learned was consistently discouraging. Automated distress signals continued to broadcast from military installations across the country, but no human voices responded to their attempts at communication. International broadcasts painted an equally grim picture. The infection had spread globally, overwhelming governments and military forces that had been confident in their ability to contain any threat. Marcus established a daily briefing system where he shared relevant information while filtering out the most disturbing reports. The truth was that civilization appeared to have collapsed completely within the first 2 weeks of the outbreak. Major cities were either overrun or had been abandoned entirely. The military's initial attempts at creating safe zones had failed catastrophically when infected individuals managed to infiltrate the secure areas. On the 20th day after the outbreak, they encountered their first major security breach. A small group of infected had somehow made their way up the mountain, possibly following the scent trails left by the Pine Ridge survivors. The facility's motion sensors detected them first, triggering alarms that sent everyone into the predetermined emergency positions. Through the security cameras, Marcus counted at least 12 infected individuals shambling through the outer perimeter. The infected were clearly different from the fresh ones they had seen in the early days. These showed signs of significant decomposition, their movements more erratic and aggressive. Their clothes were torn and stained, and several were missing limbs or showed evidence of other severe injuries that would have been fatal to normal humans. Yet they continued moving with the same relentless determination that characterized all infected individuals. Jake positioned himself at the main security station while Marcus coordinated the response from the observation deck. They had spent weeks preparing for this scenario, but facing actual infected attackers was different from running drills. The facility's automated defense systems included motion-activated floodlights and sound deterrents, but these proved ineffective against enemies that showed no fear or self-preservation instincts. The infected began testing the perimeter fence systematically, pressing against it and searching for weaknesses. The electrified barriers held initially, but the infected seemed to learn from each shock, eventually finding a section where previous damage had created a gap in the electrical system. Within minutes, they had breached the outer perimeter and were advancing toward the main building. Marcus made the difficult decision to activate the facility's emergency lockdown, sealing all entrances and windows with reinforced barriers. The procedure was designed to protect against external threats, but it also trapped them inside with limited air circulation and no means of escape. As they watched through the security monitors, the infected surrounded the building, pounding on walls and trying to find any possible entry point. Dr. Mitchell gathered the civilian survivors in the main laboratory, the most secure area of the facility. The children huddled close to Lisa while the adults maintained nervous silence, listening to the sounds of the infected attackers outside. Emma Martinez began crying softly, and despite everyone's efforts to comfort her, the sound seemed to attract even more attention from the creatures surrounding them. The siege lasted 14 hours. The infected showed no signs of tiring or losing interest, maintaining their assault on the building throughout the night. Several of them managed to reach second-story windows, using their inhuman strength to climb the building's exterior. The reinforced glass held, but spider web cracks began appearing under the constant pressure of their attacks. Part 3. Dawn brought no relief from the siege, but it did provide better visibility to assess their situation. Marcus counted at least 20 infected surrounding the facility, with more arriving throughout the morning. The overnight attack had revealed critical weaknesses in their defenses that he had never considered. The infected showed a level of persistence and problem-solving ability that challenged every assumption about their intelligence and capabilities. Jake's military experience proved crucial in developing countermeasures. He identified several vulnerable points in the building's structure and worked with the maintenance staff to reinforce them using materials from the facility's workshop. Meanwhile, Dr. Rodriguez used the laboratory equipment to analyze sound recordings of the infected, searching for patterns that might help them understand how these creatures communicated and coordinated their attacks. The psychological impact on the survivors was becoming increasingly evident. Several people had stopped eating entirely, paralyzed by fear and despair. Others had begun displaying signs of severe anxiety and depression that threatened their ability to function as a group. Dr. Mitchell attempted to provide counseling support, but her expertise lay in atmospheric science, not human psychology. The burden of maintaining morale fell increasingly on Marcus and Jake, neither of whom felt qualified for the role. Lisa worked tirelessly to keep the children distracted and educated, but Emma's nightmares were getting worse. The little girl had begun talking to imaginary friends, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. The other children were showing similar signs of psychological distress, and the adults worried about the long-term effects of trauma on such young minds. On the third day of the siege, they discovered that the infected were learning from their previous attempts. Instead of mindlessly attacking the same reinforced areas, they had begun focusing their efforts on the building's ventilation system and utility connections. Several creatures had climbed onto the roof and were systematically damaging the solar panel array that supplemented their generator power. Others had located the main electrical feed and were working to expose the cables. The facility's communication systems detected an unexpected signal on the emergency frequency, a human voice broadcasting from somewhere in the region. The transmission was weak and filled with static, but Marcus managed to make out fragments of a message about a government safe zone being established in Denver. The broadcast claimed that military forces were working to evacuate survivors and establish secure areas where people could rebuild their lives. Hope surged through the group, but Marcus remained skeptical. Denver was over 200 miles away, and the route would take them through several major population centers that were likely overrun with infected. Even if the broadcast was legitimate, reaching the safe zone would require vehicles, fuel, and weapons that they didn't possess. The infected surrounding their facility demonstrated that travel would be extremely dangerous, if not impossible. Dr. Mitchell advocated for attempting to reach the Denver safe zone, arguing that their current situation was unsustainable. Their food supplies were dwindling faster than anticipated, and the siege had accelerated their consumption of generator fuel due to the increased security measures. Jake disagreed, pointing out that they had no way to verify the broadcast's authenticity and that leaving their defended position would likely result in everyone's death. The debate revealed deep divisions within the group that had been simmering beneath the surface. Some survivors wanted to take aggressive action against the infected surrounding them, arguing that a coordinated attack might clear the immediate area and give them options for movement. Others insisted that their best chance lay in maintaining their defensive position and waiting for rescue that might never come. Marcus found himself caught between competing factions, each with valid concerns and no good solutions. The stress of leadership was taking its toll on his physical and mental health. He had lost significant weight due to reduced food intake and constant worry, and his hands had developed a persistent tremor that he tried to hide from the others. The responsibility for 63 lives weighed heavily on his conscience, especially when every decision could mean the difference between survival and death. The infected outside seemed to sense the growing desperation within the facility. Their attacks became more coordinated and focused, targeting specific weak points that they had identified through their continuous probing. Several had begun using debris and tools they found around the facility's exterior to enhance their assault, demonstrating a level of tool use that contradicted initial assumptions about their cognitive abilities. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during the early morning hours of the fourth day. One of the infected managed to damage a ventilation grate on the building's north side, creating an opening barely large enough for a human to crawl through. The creature couldn't fit through the gap, but its persistence had created their first real vulnerability since the siege began. Part 4. The damaged ventilation grate became the focal point of everyone's attention as Marcus and Jake developed contingency plans for what seemed like an inevitable breach. The opening was too small for the infected to use immediately, but their relentless scratching and clawing was gradually widening it. Calculations suggested they had perhaps 18 hours before the gap became large enough for an infected individual to squeeze through. Jake proposed a desperate solution that would require splitting their group and taking enormous risks. A small team could exit through the facility's emergency tunnel system, which connected to a maintenance shed about 200 yards from the main building. From there, they could potentially circle around and eliminate the infected near the damaged ventilation grate, buying time to make proper repairs. The plan required precise timing and would leave the main group vulnerable if something went wrong. Dr. Mitchell vehemently opposed the idea, arguing that they should focus on reinforcing the damaged area from inside the building. She had identified several industrial adhesives and metal sheeting in the laboratory that could potentially seal the breach permanently. However, Marcus realized that any internal repairs would require someone to work directly beneath the opening while infected creatures attempted to claw their way through from above. The children's deteriorating psychological state added urgency to their decision-making process. Emma had stopped speaking entirely except to her imaginary friends, and the other children were showing signs of severe trauma that worried all the adults. Lisa reported that they were barely eating and had begun displaying behaviors suggesting they were preparing to give up entirely. The siege was destroying their will to survive as effectively as any physical attack. Food supplies reached a critical threshold that forced Marcus to implement even stricter rationing measures. Each person now received approximately 60% of their minimum caloric needs, a reduction that was already affecting everyone's energy levels and cognitive function. Dr. Rodriguez's latest calculations showed they had perhaps 10 days of food remaining at current consumption levels, assuming no additional stress on their supplies. The facility's generator system began showing signs of strain from the extended emergency operation period. Several backup systems that normally cycled on and off were running continuously to maintain their security measures and life support functions. The fuel consumption rate had increased by 40%, and warning indicators suggested that critical maintenance was overdue. If the generator failed, they would lose their security monitoring, communications, and food preservation capabilities. Marcus made the decision to attempt Jake's rescue plan, but with significant modifications to reduce the risks involved. Instead of a direct assault on the infected near the ventilation breach, they would create a diversion on the opposite side of the building to draw the creatures away from the damaged area. Meanwhile, a repair team would work from inside to seal the breach using materials from the laboratory and workshop. The team consisted of Jake, 2 maintenance workers, and Marcus himself, leaving the facility through the emergency tunnel system during the pre-dawn hours when infected activity typically decreased. The tunnel had been designed as an escape route for facility personnel during emergencies, but it had never been tested under actual crisis conditions. The passage was narrow, poorly lit, and filled with mechanical equipment that made movement difficult and noisy. Emerging from the maintenance shed felt like stepping into an alien landscape. The infected had left signs of their presence throughout the area: damaged vegetation, disturbed ground, and an overwhelming stench of decay that made breathing difficult. The creatures themselves were scattered around the main building's perimeter, but their positions had shifted since the last security camera survey. Several new arrivals had joined the original group, increasing their total number to nearly 30. Jake's military training proved invaluable as he guided the team through the terrain, using natural cover and shadows to avoid detection. The plan called for them to reach a position approximately 50 yards from the building's south wall, where they could create enough noise and activity to attract the infected away from the north side breach. They carried improvised noise makers constructed from laboratory equipment and metal containers that would create maximum disturbance when activated. The diversion worked better than expected, but also created unexpected complications. The noise attracted not only the infected surrounding their building, but also additional creatures from the surrounding area. Within minutes of activating their improvised alarm system, Marcus counted over 40 infected individuals converging on their position. The repair team inside the facility had a clear opportunity to work on the ventilation breach, but the external team found themselves surrounded by far more enemies than they had anticipated. Jake made the tactical decision to abandon their original extraction plan and move to a secondary position they had identified during their reconnaissance. The maintenance shed that had served as their exit point was now surrounded by infected individuals, making return impossible through their planned route. They would need to find alternative shelter and wait for an opportunity to return to the main building, assuming they could survive long enough to identify one. Part 5. The external team found temporary refuge in a small equipment shelter built into the mountainside, originally designed to house monitoring instruments for the research station's atmospheric studies. The concrete structure was solid but basic, with no amenities beyond a single ventilation shaft and enough space for 4 people to sit uncomfortably. Through the small observation window, Marcus watched dozens of infected individuals spreading across the facility grounds, their numbers continuing to grow as more arrived from the surrounding wilderness. Inside the main building, Dr. Mitchell coordinated the repair efforts with desperate efficiency. The laboratory's industrial adhesives were proving effective at sealing the ventilation breach, but the work required multiple people to hold metal sheeting in place while the bonding agents cured. The process was complicated by the constant noise and vibration from infected individuals directly above them, scratching and clawing at the exterior grating with renewed intensity. Jake used his tactical radio to maintain contact with the main facility, providing updates on the infected movements outside while receiving reports on the repair progress. The communication had to be kept brief and quiet to avoid attracting attention to their hiding spot, but it provided crucial coordination between the two groups. The infected appeared to be exhibiting pack-like behavior, with some individuals maintaining watch positions while others actively searched for entry points. The psychological strain on everyone involved reached new extremes during the 18 hours they remained separated. Lisa worked overtime to keep the children calm and occupied, but Emma's condition continued deteriorating. The little girl had begun displaying physical symptoms alongside her mental distress, refusing to eat, persistent trembling, and what appeared to be selective hearing loss. Dr. Mitchell suspected severe trauma response but lacked the expertise to provide effective treatment. Food rationing became even more critical with the team separated and unable to coordinate their consumption. The main facility had the majority of their remaining supplies, but the external team had emergency rations that were originally intended for short-term use. Marcus realized that their division had effectively reduced everyone's available nutrition, accelerating their path toward starvation. The mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly grim with each passing hour. The infected demonstrated learning behavior that continued to surprise and disturb the survivors. Instead of randomly attacking the building, they had begun systematically testing different areas and appeared to be communicating information about weaknesses they discovered. Several creatures had climbed onto the roof and were working together to remove solar panels and expose underlying structural elements. Others had located the facility's water intake system and were attempting to contaminate or block their water supply. Dr. Rodriguez made a disturbing discovery while analyzing the behavior patterns of the infected through the security camera footage. The creatures appeared to be exhibiting rudimentary problem-solving skills and memory retention that suggested more cognitive function than initially assumed. They remembered which areas had been reinforced and focused their subsequent attacks on different locations. Some individuals seemed to be directing the activities of others, establishing a primitive hierarchy among the infected population. The facility's power situation became critical when the generator system triggered multiple warning alarms simultaneously. The extended operation under emergency conditions had pushed several components beyond their design specifications, and critical repairs were needed to prevent complete system failure. However, accessing the generator room required passing through areas that were being actively attacked by infected individuals, making maintenance work extremely dangerous. Marcus made the difficult decision to attempt a nighttime return to the main building, leaving Jake and one maintenance worker in the shelter while he and the other worker tried to reach the facility through an alternative route they had identified. The plan required crossing approximately 300 yards of open ground during the darkest hours before dawn, when infected activity typically decreased but visibility was at its worst. The journey back exposed them to the full horror of what the infected had done to the facility's immediate environment. The creatures had systematically destroyed or contaminated everything they encountered, leaving behind a wasteland of damaged equipment, scattered debris, and the unmistakable evidence of their presence. The stench was overwhelming, and both men had to stop multiple times to prevent themselves from vomiting and making noise that would attract attention. They successfully reached the building's emergency entrance, but the reunion with the main group was tempered by sobering updates on their situation. The ventilation breach had been successfully sealed, but the repairs were temporary at best and would require regular maintenance to remain effective. The generator system was operating on borrowed time, and several other building systems were showing signs of stress from the extended siege conditions. Most concerning was the revelation that their food supplies had been contaminated during the attack. Several infected individuals had somehow accessed the facility's external storage areas and had damaged or destroyed approximately 30% of their remaining provisions. Dr. Rodriguez's new calculations showed they had perhaps 6 days of food remaining, assuming optimal rationing and no further losses. The mathematics of survival had shifted dramatically against them. The external team's return also brought intelligence about the infected population that surrounded them. Jake's observations suggested they were dealing with at least 60 individual creatures, with new arrivals continuing to join the group. The infected showed no signs of losing interest or moving on to other areas, apparently drawn by some characteristic of the facility or its occupants that kept them focused on the location. Part 6. The contamination of their food supplies forced Marcus to confront the reality that their defensive strategy was failing. While they had successfully repelled direct attacks on the building, the infected were winning through attrition, systematically destroying or contaminating the resources needed for long-term survival. The siege had evolved from a simple assault into a methodical campaign designed to force them out of their protected position. Dr. Mitchell called an emergency meeting of all adult survivors to discuss their increasingly limited options. The debate that followed revealed the full extent of fear and desperation that had been building within the group. Some argued for attempting to break out and reach the rumored safe zone in Denver, while others insisted on maintaining their defensive position and hoping for eventual rescue. A third faction, led by several of the Pine Ridge survivors, suggested attempting to negotiate or communicate with the infected to understand what they wanted. Jake's reconnaissance had identified a potential escape route through the facility's research vehicle garage, which connected to a service road that the infected hadn't yet discovered. The facility maintained 3 vehicles designed for wilderness research work, including one with off-road capabilities that might be able to navigate mountain terrain while avoiding major roads. However, the garage was located on the building's ground level and would be extremely vulnerable during any evacuation attempt. The children's deteriorating condition added urgency to every decision. Emma had stopped responding to external stimuli entirely, remaining in a catatonic state that deeply concerned all the adults. The other children were showing similar signs of psychological withdrawal, and Lisa reported that traditional educational and entertainment activities were no longer effective at maintaining their engagement. Dr. Mitchell suspected that prolonged exposure to extreme stress was causing permanent psychological damage. Marcus assigned teams to begin preparing for a potential evacuation while simultaneously maintaining their defensive preparations. The dual approach required dividing their already stretched human resources, but he recognized that they needed multiple options available as their situation continued to deteriorate. One team worked on vehicle preparation and route planning, while another focused on creating portable supplies and emergency equipment that could be carried during a hasty departure. The facility's communication equipment detected another broadcast on the emergency frequency, this one much clearer and more detailed than previous transmissions. A military unit claiming to be part of the Federal Emergency Management Agency was coordinating evacuation efforts from multiple locations across Colorado and neighboring states. They provided specific grid coordinates and schedules for helicopter pickups, along with authentication codes that suggested legitimate government authorization. However, the broadcast also contained disturbing information about the overall situation across the country. The infection had spread to every state and major population center, with casualty estimates suggesting that over 70% of the population was either dead or infected. International communications indicated similar catastrophic losses worldwide, with no country successfully containing the outbreak. The safe zones were described as temporary measures rather than permanent solutions, designed to buy time for the development of more comprehensive survival strategies. Dr. Rodriguez used the facility's computer systems to analyze the evacuation broadcast and compare it with their geographical location. The nearest pickup point was approximately 40 miles southeast of their position, located in a valley area that would require crossing several infected population centers. The scheduled pickup was in 72 hours, leaving them with a narrow window to reach the location if they decided to attempt the journey. The decision to trust the evacuation broadcast sparked intense debate among the survivors. Jake's military experience made him skeptical of any government claims, arguing that legitimate rescue operations would have more comprehensive communication protocols and verification procedures. Dr. Mitchell countered that they had no other realistic options for survival and that the broadcast represented their best hope for escape from their deteriorating situation. Marcus found himself weighing factors that seemed almost impossible to balance. The facility provided protection but was becoming uninhabitable due to resource depletion and the persistent infected presence. The evacuation offered hope but required traveling through extremely dangerous territory with no guarantee that the promised rescue would actually materialize. Both options carried substantial risks of death, but inaction also guaranteed eventual starvation or worse. The infected outside seemed to sense the increased activity within the building, responding with more aggressive and coordinated attacks on their defenses. Several creatures had begun working together to move large debris against the building's walls, apparently attempting to create climbing platforms that would allow access to upper-level windows. Others had located the facility's backup generator exhaust vents and were systematically blocking them, threatening to cause carbon monoxide buildup that could force the survivors to shut down critical systems. Food rationing reached starvation levels as Marcus implemented the most restrictive distribution schedule possible while keeping people functional. Each person received approximately 40% of their minimum caloric needs, a reduction that was already causing noticeable physical deterioration among the group. Several elderly survivors were showing signs of malnutrition-related health problems, and everyone's energy levels had dropped to the point where maintaining essential functions required significant effort. The generator system triggered another series of critical alarms, indicating that total power failure was imminent without immediate maintenance. However, the repair work required accessing external components that were currently surrounded by infected individuals. Marcus realized they were approaching a decision point where all their options carried extreme risks, and delaying action would only make their situation worse. Part 7. The generator failure occurred at 3:47 a.m. on what Marcus had privately begun thinking of as their last day at the facility. The sudden loss of power plunged the building into darkness and silence, cutting off their security monitoring, communication systems, and climate control. Emergency battery systems provided minimal lighting in critical areas, but those reserves were designed for short-term use and would be exhausted within 12 hours under current consumption rates. Without electrical power, the building's defensive systems were compromised, leaving them vulnerable to attacks they had previously been able to monitor and anticipate. The infected outside seemed to sense the change immediately, increasing their assault on the building's perimeter with renewed intensity. Jake organized watch teams at strategic windows, using manual observation to track infected movements, but their visibility was severely limited without the security camera network. The loss of refrigeration systems meant that their remaining food supplies would spoil rapidly, accelerating their timeline toward complete starvation. Dr. Rodriguez calculated that they had perhaps 3 days of edible provisions remaining, assuming they could access all the stored food before bacterial contamination made it dangerous to consume. The mathematics of survival had shifted decisively against them. Emma finally broke her catatonic state, but her emergence brought new concerns about her mental condition. The little girl began speaking constantly to her imaginary friends, carrying on detailed conversations about people and places that didn't exist. Her behavior suggested severe psychological dissociation, and she seemed unaware of the actual crisis surrounding them. Lisa worked desperately to maintain some connection with reality, but Emma's condition appeared to be deteriorating rather than improving. Marcus made the decision to attempt the evacuation to the government pickup point, recognizing that remaining at the facility would result in certain death within days. The choice required abandoning their defensible position and venturing into territory filled with infected individuals, but their current situation offered no realistic alternatives. Jake began preparing the most capable vehicle for the journey while Marcus organized the group for what might be their final desperate gamble. The evacuation preparations revealed just how much their situation had deteriorated during the siege. Several survivors were too weak from malnutrition to travel effectively, and the children would require constant supervision during any movement through dangerous territory. They had virtually no weapons beyond improvised tools, and their knowledge of infected behavior was limited to observations made from inside their protected facility. Dr. Mitchell worked with the available medical supplies to prepare treatment kits for injuries they might sustain during travel. However, their pharmaceutical resources were minimal, consisting primarily of basic first aid materials and over-the-counter medications. Any serious injury or medical emergency during the evacuation would likely be fatal, as they had no access to advanced medical care or equipment. The vehicle preparation process uncovered another critical problem that threatened to derail their evacuation plans. The research vehicles had been designed for scientific fieldwork rather than survival situations, and their fuel capacity was insufficient for the journey to the pickup point without refueling opportunities. The facility's fuel storage tanks contained enough gasoline to fill their chosen vehicle, but accessing the tanks required venturing outside the building while infected individuals maintained their siege positions. Jake developed a plan for creating a diversion that would allow a small team to reach the fuel storage area while the majority of infected were drawn to a different location. The strategy required precise timing and coordination, as any mistakes would likely result in team members being overwhelmed by creatures that showed no mercy or hesitation in their attacks. The plan also assumed that they could start the vehicle and begin their evacuation before the infected realized what was happening and moved to block their escape route. The final preparations took on an almost ritualistic quality as people packed what few possessions they could carry while abandoning everything else they had accumulated during their time at the facility. Personal items, research data, and equipment that had once seemed important were left behind as the harsh realities of survival reduced their concerns to the most basic necessities. Each person could carry only what was absolutely essential for the journey ahead. Marcus gathered everyone for what he suspected might be their final group meeting at the facility. The faces around him showed the physical and emotional toll of their ordeal: sunken cheeks from malnutrition, hollow eyes from chronic stress, and the haunted expressions of people who had seen too much death and suffering. Yet he also saw determination and a stubborn refusal to surrender that gave him hope for their chances during the evacuation attempt. The broadcast schedule indicated that the helicopter pickup would occur at dawn, giving them approximately 8 hours to travel 40 miles through mountainous terrain while avoiding infected populations. The timeline was extremely tight, requiring them to maintain an average speed that might be impossible given the road conditions and obstacles they would likely encounter. However, missing the pickup would strand them in an even worse situation than their current position. As they prepared to leave the facility that had been their home and fortress for nearly a month, Marcus reflected on how dramatically their world had changed since the outbreak began. The people around him had become his family through shared hardship and mutual dependence, and he felt responsible for their survival in ways that went far beyond his original job description as head of security. Part 8. The fuel retrieval operation began during the darkest hour before dawn, when infected activity typically reached its lowest point. Jake led a 3-person team through the emergency tunnel while Marcus coordinated from inside the building, using handheld radios to maintain communication. The infected had established a perimeter around the fuel storage area, but their numbers were reduced compared to the main siege positions around the building. The diversion worked flawlessly, drawing most of the infected toward the building's east wall where Marcus had activated every noise-making device they could improvise. The creatures responded with their characteristic single-minded focus, abandoning their previous positions to investigate the disturbance. Jake's team reached the fuel storage tanks and began the pumping process, but the manual operation required more time than anticipated due to the facility's backup systems being offline. Inside the building, the evacuation groups were organized according to the plan Marcus and Jake had developed. Dr. Mitchell led the first group, consisting of the children and elderly survivors who would need assistance during the journey. Lisa took charge of Emma, who had retreated back into her catatonic state as the stress of preparation overwhelmed her fragile psychological condition. The second group included the remaining adults and would provide security for the convoy during travel. The vehicle started on the first attempt, a small miracle given the stress everyone was experiencing. Jake maneuvered it into position near the building's main entrance while the fuel team completed their operations and began their return through the tunnel system. The infected were still focused on the diversion area, but their attention was beginning to shift as they realized the noise wasn't producing any accessible targets. Loading the survivors into the vehicle required careful coordination to avoid attracting infected attention while ensuring everyone could fit safely. The research vehicle had been designed for a maximum of 8 passengers, but they were attempting to transport 63 people. The solution involved using the vehicle's cargo areas and roof rack to accommodate additional passengers, though these positions offered minimal protection and comfort during what would be a harrowing journey. The initial escape from the facility went smoother than anyone had dared hope. Jake followed a service road that led away from the main infected concentration, maintaining minimal speed to reduce engine noise while navigating by moonlight with headlights turned off. The infected at the facility seemed unaware of their departure for the first several minutes, giving them a crucial head start toward their destination. However, their relief was short-lived as they encountered the first major obstacle within 5 miles of the facility. A bridge over a mountain creek had been damaged by infected individuals, leaving a gap too wide for their vehicle to cross safely. Jake was forced to find an alternative route that added significant time and distance to their journey, while also taking them through areas where they had no intelligence about infected populations. The detour led them through the remains of Pine Ridge, the town where many of their passengers had originally lived before fleeing to the research facility. The devastation was complete and horrifying, with evidence of the infected outbreak visible in every destroyed building and abandoned vehicle. Several team members broke down emotionally as they passed landmarks from their former lives, now transformed into monuments to the collapse of civilization. Emma's condition deteriorated further during the journey, as the stress and motion triggered severe panic responses that required constant attention from Lisa and Dr. Mitchell. The little girl's screams threatened to attract infected attention, forcing them to make several unplanned stops to calm her before continuing. Each delay reduced their chances of reaching the pickup point on schedule and increased their exposure to discovery by hostile forces. The final approach to the evacuation site revealed both hope and new dangers. The government pickup point was clearly marked and appeared to be legitimate, with evidence of military activity including cleared landing areas and communication equipment. However, they weren't the only survivors who had received the broadcast message. Dozens of other groups had converged on the location, creating a refugee camp atmosphere that was chaotic and difficult to control. As dawn approached and they waited for the promised helicopter evacuation, Marcus realized that their survival had depended as much on luck and timing as on preparation and teamwork. The infected threat remained omnipresent, with creatures attracted by the concentration of survivors beginning to appear at the perimeter of the pickup site. The helicopter's arrival would signal either salvation or the beginning of another desperate fight for survival. The sound of rotor blades approaching from the east brought tears of relief to faces that had almost forgotten what hope felt like. But as Marcus watched the aircraft descend toward their location 2/2 retry, this response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. Hit continue to nudge Claude along. Continue. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Sonnet 4.